right, so I'm here with Logan. He is a classical musician living in beautiful San Francisco, and he's written a couple of articles here. The ones that caught my eye were regarding urban planning and the housing market. So I guess I kind of want to start off with the housing crisis because I think that maybe the stock market's going to crash, maybe it's not. There's a lot of economic variables, but one of them that's been pretty consistent for, well, really since I guess the end of the 2008 crash, around the last 10 years, is this question of, why is housing so expensive? Is it ever going to come down? I think there's something called the Case-Shiller Index that tracks, how historically aberrant are housing prices. So could you just go a little bit into why you think the housing crisis is stupid?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the Portland area, and now I'm in San Francisco, and I've lived in New York, and I've been in all these like extremely housing constrained markets where through my entire sort of progressive lefty upbringing, there was all this like gentrification discourse. And now just in like the last few years, we've been getting to more of a consensus understanding, well, maybe not consensus yet, but budding understanding of the nature of the housing shortage. And a really good person to read on this is Kevin Erdman, because he talks about how he's a actual professional economist, not just a layman dork like me. And he talks a lot about how the housing shortage has been budding since well before the 2008 crisis. Really, we've been systematically underproducing housing since the 1970s with a lot of the sort of environmental conservation movement, degrowth stuff, and it's all sort of rooted in California to begin with. So now I'm at the epicenter of the problem. And it's just very baked into this whole home voter hypothesis thing where people who own homes and are financially invested in the value of homes going up then want there to be a shortage and vote for things that preserve the character of the neighborhood, or that they use all these various NIMBY phrases, and it just spirals further and further out of control. And then the response, the backlash, is to go, oh, we can't build more housing because that'll cause gentrification. Well, the reason that the cheaper neighborhood is getting more expensive is the causality is completely backwards. The prices aren't going up because you built more housing. People are starting to build housing in the cheaper neighborhoods because the prices are going up, and it becomes more financially viable to build housing in an undesirable neighborhood when the people who would like to live in the nice neighborhood can't afford it anymore. So
Yeah, I guess I'm not having enough stupid conversations because I believe what you're saying is correct. I think there's like an activist class of people where if I went into a bad neighborhood in Detroit, for example, and I bulldozed one of the decrepit old homes, and then I started building a really nice home there, I'm sure there would be someone somewhere would say, hey, don't gentrify this neighborhood. You're destroying the character of this neighborhood. So it's almost like from both ends, there is, and I'm going to use this word in a way that's not correct, I suppose, but it's conservative, right? You have on the one hand people who say, well, let's keep the character of the neighborhood the same, because they're afraid of, when I've talked to people in California who own homes and I've said, why can't we build more homes? They say, well, we'd love to do that, but then you're bringing in all this crime and these people, we don't want them here. And on the other hand, you say, okay, well, I won't build in your fancy neighborhood. I'll go to a poor place and build. And then they're saying, no, we can't destroy the character of this neighborhood. There's like this unique culture here. And one of the issues that I have, I mean, maybe this is just from being a nomad, but when I see those little signs and plaques that say, this is a historic neighborhood, the people who live here came here 60 years ago and they did the first this and that and the other. And I'm like, 60 years is not a long time, so the idea that constitutes a historic neighborhood, and then we have to protect that. You also talk a little bit about maybe this is more. I was reading your comments section, and we're talking about keeping waterfronts public, and this is something that I've really struggled to come up with a solution for, because so many of the people who own waterfront property are very rich. And so if you try to change the law about this, you're going to have a lot of money against you. And so one of the ways that I thought of, like, maybe this wouldn't really help, but just rather than trying to deal with this on a local level, because I guess to explain, let's say you're on a beach in California and you say, well, we have all these houses on the beach, on the waterfront, but we actually want to make this public. We want people to access this. And so we're going to redraw the property lines, and you don't have exclusive access to this anymore, whatever. You're going to, if you try to do that let's say the city council says that, well, we're going to raise property taxes, or even on the state level. I guess my opinion is that it's going to be easier for rich people to enforce their will on a local level than on a national level. So the best strategy, and I could be wrong about this, would be to say we're going to have a national property tax, which we currently don't have. We have a national income tax. We have capital gains tax. We have even, I think that there's, tariffs. So essentially is a form of sales tax coming in and out of the country. But we don't have a national property tax. And my idea would be to just say, like, if you have property within a certain distance from a waterfront, whether that's 500 feet, 1,000 feet, or 10 miles, I mean, you could actually do it. You could just create an equation where it says, your distance to the waterfront equals your national property tax. And I would call it, something like the Waterfront Protection Act or something. And then, so, what would happen is the first year they would have this kind of marginal tax. Maybe it'd be, less than 1% of the home value or something. It wouldn't really be significant. But over time, it would be meant to incrementally increase. So you're sort of trying to boil the frog on saying, I understand you own this property and you don't want to let go of it, and you want to have the exclusive access to the waterfront. But, we have significant problems, not just in terms of people like waterfronts and people would like to have access to that, but also environmentally, what you're doing when you build a bunch of really rich houses on a waterfront is you're attracting and you're drawing in economic activity. And a long time ago, that made a lot of sense because transportation was extremely expensive. So if you wanted to get goods from Europe or anywhere else in the world, they had to arrive at a port city like Boston, D.C., New York, and then if you wanted to transport that to Kansas, that was a much higher additional cost. Now there's basically no difference between, if you buy something on Alibaba and have it shipped to New York City versus the middle of Kansas, that shipping cost is not so great that, there's an economic necessity in concentrating our populations on the coast. There's really no reason why that New York City needs to be our most populous city. So the idea from my perspective is that not only are you trying to open up those for aesthetic reasons to allow people to have that as a public good, but also for environmental reasons. You're saying, okay, this is a sensitive habitat, and also preventatively, like in Florida, every 8 years or something, they have a hurricane that blows through, and then that cost is shouldered oftentimes by the federal government, by FEMA, and so on, disaster relief funds that come from everybody, not just from Florida. So it is, that's what Florida's taking all the money from everywhere else. So I throw a lot at you about waterfront stuff. Do you have anything to riff off on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd like to start right where you started. I mean, Detroit is such a counterexample to a lot of these problems, because I think a lot of the American sort of chattering class, the media bubble, whatever you want to call it, is really centered in these cities that are struggling with the problems of growth, that they're so successful that so many people are moving there, and that is causing all these housing problems. And that's very different from Detroit, which is suffering population loss and economic downturn. Um, and those kinds of problems just have very different solutions. I think the local perspective makes degrowthers look really dumb. When you look at a city that's growing and a city that's shrinking, it makes the benefits of growth really apparently obvious. That's like Jane Jacobs' book. I mean, her famous one is the death and life of great American cities. But one of her other books was Cities and the Wealth of Nations, riffing off the Adam Smith title. And her whole perspective that she's advocating in that book is that measuring a national economy is really obscuring a lot of vital information, and almost all the crucial things to understand about economic growth and development come from looking at the city region as your measure of economics. That cities are economic units, and a country will amalgamate the urban-rural divide and huge inequalities and doesn't really capture the image. So looking at the economy of Detroit, there's a very different, I think there's less, they're very enthusiastic about gentrification in Detroit. They want people to make things nicer. It's the San Francisco problem of too much growth that makes people take on this sort of NIMBY conservative historic preservation mindset. There's a good Strong Towns article. Strong Towns is an advocacy organization in the urbanism space. There's a great Strong Towns article titled something like Where You Live is Not New York City, just sort of talking about how a lot of these problems that get a lot of attention in the media about urbanism and growth and housing coming from the perspective of these mega cities is not really applicable when you're talking about a suburb of Kenosha or something like that, which is like the Matt Iglesias article. The average voter is a 50-something white person in an unfashionable suburb. So just taking the different problems of different cities seriously on their own merits.
One of the things that when I look at something like Detroit or something like Memphis, Tennessee, which we've got this Mississippi River, Memphis is sort of strategically located on this branch point on it, so a lot of tonnage in terms of shipping has to go through there. When I look at these cities that have this endemic poverty, I think some people would like to say, kind of keep just sort of that gradual transformation through gentrification. That you start buying up blocks of houses, you make them nice, and eventually, over time, this is how. But do we actually have? I mean, I think on a local level, sure, there are examples of that genuinely happening. I don't think anyone would dispute that there are neighborhoods that used to be poor and then they were gentrified and now they're wealthy. But using that model you're talking about, thinking about a city as a whole, holistic, like organic unit, I mean, maybe we just think the time period is too slow, but is there actually evidence that you can take a city? I'm almost thinking of like the ancient world. Like, ancient Rome or something went through this population decline and collapse. And I guess you could say ancient or Rome, the city today, has recovered, but I don't know, like 1,000 years later, right? So I guess in terms of expedience, maybe, yes, eventually we could create some mathematical model where gentrification will eventually solve the problems of Detroit. But I guess I'm wondering if it wouldn't just be more expedient to like build an entirely brand new city in the middle of Kansas and then kind of be like, okay, we're going to structurally set things up in a better way, and it's going to be easier to bring people here and to like for the country as a whole, it's going to be easier to whatever the standard is. If it's an increase in GDP, if it's a decrease in crime, whatever that is, we're going to have more impact on the national figures and statistics by just starting from scratch than by trying to fix existing structures, because the incentive for Detroit being in Detroit, or the people of Detroit being in that location, is because of basically geographical factors that are no longer as relevant. And so we have the freedom to work around that. And do you think there's any merit to that, or do you think we should try to fix the problems where they are?
I think the geographical factors are maybe less and less relevant, and that's maybe more reason to just invest in the cities we have, because so much more of it is just having an existing agglomeration economy in a city with a lot of people. Like there were these some like rich people in California in the Bay Area who were trying to start this initiative that has now fizzled out to build a brand new city up in some like agricultural land, like in between San Francisco and Sacramento. And they wanted to start a brand new city. And it just raises all these dilemmas of the transportation infrastructure that we've already invested in and the sort of like social capital that exists in cities. And people want to, you'd way rather build more housing in San Francisco than build new housing kind of vaguely in the greater San Francisco region, because people want to be in San Francisco and it's good to satisfy those people's wants. I mean, Kevin Erdman, the housing economist I mentioned earlier, refers to this certain cohort of like high growth but low housing construction cities as the closed access cities. And I forget exactly what his list is, but it's something like New York City, San Francisco, LA, San Diego. So California is a big problem in this whole thing. Boston, Washington, D.C. might be on there, but it's sort of the expected players. And there's this big factor of like, as these economies are growing, the incomes are going up and up and up. And he calls them the closed access cities to refute the fact that a lot of these cities have been dubbed by other people like superstar cities. But the problem of the average incomes of these cities going up and up and up as they don't build any housing is that so much of that average income increase is just coming from pricing out people who have lower incomes. And so building enough housing in the places that already have these active agglomeration city economies allows the lower income people to stay and ride the rising tide. But if you don't build the housing and you kick them out, then that just, it's the worst of both worlds, because you're stomping down on the growth, the potential economic growth that this city is producing. You're squandering this massive opportunity to build a lot of prosperity. And then you're also punching the worst off while they're down and kicking them out of this opportunity as it's arising.
I guess I'm skeptical of the like an undifferentiated value of citizenry in terms of economic productivity. So, for example, in Detroit, I think that if we built a lot of housing and we, I don't know, to start with that, like I guess everything else would follow. And we improve. Okay,
well, I
go
think
ahead.
building a lot of housing in Detroit is missing the point of like treating the different problems of different cities. Like Detroit's problem isn't not enough housing. They have an abundance of housing. They don't have enough people. And so they need to perhaps start from a different problem. But in San Francisco, the problem is not enough housing.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think you're correct about that. So I guess maybe taking something like New York, where there is a housing shortage, but to that specific point about, there are people living in New York City, the people who are suffering the worst of the high cost of housing, supposedly. I guess I'm skeptical of the idea that if these people had cheaper access to housing, that they would become more economically productive for the country as a whole. That they would, for example, because now they have additional income, maybe they're going to go get an education, and this is going to increase their productivity, and everyone's going to benefit from that. I think there could be cases where that's true, but I also think you could basically make that argument irrelevant if we just made education affordable, which is a different conversation. But that would be my assessment of things, and I know people who we have a kind of a diversity of education in this country now ever since the pandemic. There's a huge amount of virtual accreditation, and I mean, again, I'm getting into an entirely different topic here, but I think we have a crisis of accreditation in this country, where there's a drive to give out or to basically to degrade the quality of the education in order to become a diploma mill. And this used to be like a scandal, and now I think it's much more normalized. And so we could even question the efficacy of that. That, like, if we just make education free, okay, more people are getting college degrees, but those college degrees are worth less and less. So does that actually increase economic productivity? Maybe not, maybe less so. But I guess what I'm saying is that, when somebody is really struggling with the cost of housing, and I think the majority of people would say, hey, I would have a lot more disposable income if it wasn't for the cost of housing. And therefore, I would stimulate all this economic growth and all these businesses, because I would be spending money on vacations, and I'd be spending money on healthcare, and I'd be spending money, whatever. I guess I'm skeptical, because I think that there are, especially in New York City, and maybe I should more empirically and get granular and detailed about this, but my estimate would be that there's roughly 10% of the population of New York City who they are struggling with housing, but they are also essentially economically non-productive. Whether they're technically employed, they're not underemployed according to their educational level, but they're sort of pseudo-employed in the sense that maybe, somebody who is like a DMV worker or a cashier or something is pseudo-employed in the sense that it's a job that where I would question, if you lower the cost of housing, does that person even have any leeway or ability to change their economic productivity? And if they had more disposable income, how valuable is that? I mean, I guess you could just kind of amalgamate all disposable income into a pile and say, like, all spending is good spending. But if that's technically true, then I mean, I don't see how you could say that, like, it's bad for people to spend an exorbitant amount or 90% of their income on rent, when it's like, okay, well, if all spending is good spending, and so the alternative to all spending is good spending is to say that, some spending is better than others. So, for example, spending on industrial products is better because we want to build up our industrial base or something like that. So, again, I've thrown out a lot there in terms of, how does increased disposable income impact our productivity? Is there a difference between something like industrial spending and housing spending and other forms of spending? I guess pick up on that wherever you want.
Yeah. Let me write one note so I don't forget. So I wanted to say one more thing on Detroit to really clarify what I was trying to say. That so in the one of the Jane Jacobs books I mentioned earlier, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, one section in that she goes about defining, trying to come up with a workable operating definition of what a slum is. And what she arrives at is a slum is a place where people who can afford to leave do. And so what I mean when I say Detroit welcomes gentrification, it's not about really adding units. It's about the sign that someone investing in it is a sign that the kind of people who can afford to leave are staying. And that means something about the upward trajectory of the city, which is a very different kind of gentrification than people complaining about a big modern apartment building going up in San Francisco, but it speaks to the unique problems of Detroit. I think on the housing shortage in these sort of superstar or or closed access cities, what it comes down to is I don't think that the least economically productive worker is going to become a software engineer making 250,000 at Google or anything, but as service worker wages increase in these cities, if these people are priced out and then they're super commuting in to San Francisco from some far distant suburb, just that isn't a good solution. That's an undignified life. They're wasting way more money on transportation. They're wasting hours of their life on their commute. And I'm looking at this issue a little bit less from the economic lens. The economic lens, it's empirically a big thumbs up to not keep perpetuating these housing shortages in terms of economic growth. But beyond the economic growth, it's if these people could afford to stay in San Francisco and work these slightly better paying service sector jobs of the rising tide of the city economy, they would just be able to live more dignified lives, have better community, and these sorts of intangibles. This is where my lefty comes out of it's not just about the growth, but there are all these sort of social atomization problems of super commuters. This was one of the big Bowling Alone findings, was that like duration of commute was directly negatively correlated with civic participation and like social connectedness. And so I just think that like reducing commute times is a great value to target in and of itself. That if this rising tide economy of a growing city is going to create all these jobs at all levels of the income distribution, including low skill service sector work, then we should also build more housing where those jobs are, because people living close to their jobs is a good in and of itself for community reasons, for living a life of dignity.
Yeah, it is. I guess we do have different perspectives. I would look at that, bowling alone finding where it's okay. People who travel more to work have less civic participation. And there's a bunch of other findings you can say, well, people who travel more for work also have higher rates of heart disease and higher rates of cancer and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't say it's the traveling that's causing them that. And the reason why is because, there are truck drivers and we can study the effects of driving on a person. So the way that I look at commute time is it's essentially part of your job to commute. Like if you say, well, I work 8 hours a day, but then I have to commute 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour back in the evening, then you essentially work 10 hours a day, and then you can divide, let's say you earn $10 an hour for, 8 hours, and you earn $80 a day. Effectively, you're actually being paid $8 an hour. Some companies account for that in commute. They'll actually pay you for your commute. Not many, though. And so that's how I look at it, is you've got people who are effectively being paid lower wages. And then the question is, okay, so we see all these negative effects correlated with high commute times. Why is that? Well, we could also just see a lot of those lower or those effects, say lower civic engagement, heart disease, cancer, if we just looked at income level. And so if we kind of adjust people's income, if we say that like essentially commuting, let's like adjust your explicit or stated income by the commute. So let's divide your work, let's add in those extra working hours, those commuting hours as work hours, and then divide your wage and adjust your income accordingly. And then what we would find in my belief, and I guess I could be wrong, but my hypothesis is that we'd find that basically those lower civic participation rates, heart rate, cancer, are an artifact of a correlation between poverty and those negative outcomes, not commuting specifically. So I guess I don't look at now the other sort of intangible that you brought up was community. Like we want people in urban cities to have a sense of community. We want them to be able to say, like, okay, I live in this neighborhood, and then I go to the store down the street and I work as a cashier, and then I come back, and therefore I'm like this provides some kind of intangible. This provides me with dignity. You know, I have friends and neighbors, and we kind of know each other. And there's maybe nepotism is like a different phenomenon, but it creates this sense of it creates this sense of like, you know, I know who's around me. As much as that, probably a lot of people do value that. I also associate that, especially in the lower income brackets. Um, I think that a lot of the um, community management problems, and sometimes that's identified as crime as the main problem, and that's understandable. But there's a whole host of other problems that wouldn't necessarily be filed under the subset of crime. So, you know, trash on the streets or graffiti or gang activity, not even necessarily the violence of the gang in itself, but in the same way that we can talk about the aesthetics of a waterfront as being an intangible benefit, I think there is an intangible cost to having gang activity, even just aside from criminal violence, in terms of loitering. That's something that's been, I guess, controversially from a left-wing perspective. That's been something that, you know, has been criminalized as you're almost criminalizing communal activity. But I'm looking at this as somebody, and maybe this is a cultural difference, right? Whereas some people would look at, you know, a group of teens loitering in a parking lot, and I see this a lot. I've traveled 47 states, so you know, I've lived next to my fair share of parking lots where there's someone in the parking lot doing donuts and burning rubber at midnight. There's people setting off fireworks in the parking lot. There's people parking in the parking lot playing very loud music and all gathering around and drinking in the parking lot. So, you know, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So some people would say, well, this is authentic community. This is what you get when you reduce commuter time, and people from a lower income are allowed to congregate and have a sense of comradeship. But for other people, and those people that I would say are more economically productive, and those people who are kind of driving the gentrification process, which I think we might agree has at least some positive benefit to it, they might say, yeah, I don't actually want to live somewhere where there's a lot of noise. And some people would say, well, just call the police, you know, issue a noise complaint. It's actually not that simple, because a lot of these places have so much crime that the police will, you know, ignore all of that. They don't have the resources to go and do that. So these are sort of intangibles that, again, you can say like, I just don't enjoy the local culture, and that's on me. That's my fault. But do you have any kind of response to somebody who would criticize that?
I mean, yeah, in many senses, like the urban NIMBYism and the suburban NIMBYism are the same thing, and we could maybe it's more culturally obvious looking at suburban NIMBYism that a lot of it is about like keeping the school white, or like keeping the town waspy and dignified and rich. And I think there's a lot of those same motivations at play in urban NIMBYism. It's just the people partaking, the like formerly hippie boomers who bought their house in San Francisco in the 70s for a quarter, aren't like going to say that stuff out loud as much as the suburbanites would, but obviously a lot of the same motivations are at play. But I would say on the commute thing, it's like there's the financial aspect and there's the time aspect for sure. It's not just about like living and working in the same community. Certainly does bring a lot of community benefits, but even if you're going from one community to another from in your commute, if it's a shorter commute, you still have more time at home. The 10-hour day versus the 8.5-hour day, once accounting for commute times, just makes a huge difference in the energy levels that you'll have, the time you'll be able to invest in your family and your friendships and all these other things. I mean, there's a good finding anecdote, I don't know, that's like, of all the things that we empirically know increase happiness, almost everything has a short-lived effect that dies off, or it requires disciplined maintenance of a habit. And the one exception is making your commute shorter, either getting a job closer to home or moving closer to work. Having a shorter commute is something you can do once and it will make you happier in a lasting way. And so that's like one angle that I look at the urbanism problem and the commute problem from. Another is just that cars are stupid expensive, and we really take that for granted and underrate it in America, because I think a lot of the middle class and upper middle class sort of tastemakers, it's like not that big of a financial burden. They can afford it. But what we're doing when we price people out far away from jobs and force them to commute is just like, it's not just the time and the erosion of community, it's having to own a car and drive that much is really, really expensive. And we're by building our environment the way that we do and sort of solving housing problems by building more sprawl further and further out on the edge, and not building walkable environments, all these problems are just like compounding inequality really, really badly.
No, I would agree with you that all of these things have to be taken into account when we look at real wages. And this is a problem. I kind of have this debate with people where it's like, well, actually, maybe real wages haven't stagnated because now we have iPhones and now we have all this cool stuff. So actually, you can buy a whole lot more. I mean, we're living like, people can get Uber Eats, and therefore we're all living like kings, and actually everything's better.
Just one facet of that is like the cost of entertainment. And to me, it's like the idea of like some big open world video game marketing itself as like hundreds of hours of gameplay is like the most just like out of touch with our contemporary problems marketing that there could possibly be. Like entertainment is too abundant and too cheap, and saying that being able to afford more entertainment as like an increase in standard of living is ridiculous. But continue your point.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. So basically, I guess what I'm saying here is that when we really like, there's multiple levels of, it's like unemployment, right? So people say, oh, well, the unemployment isn't that bad. Well, have you considered underemployment? And in a sense, the way that I view it is that as people are essentially taxed, their wages are garnished by these various costs. So I can't just get a job. First, I have to get a 4-year degree that has nothing to do with my job. Why? Because employers have such an overabundance of applicants that they need some arbitrary way of funneling down the applicants to a reasonable number of interviews, or a way of prioritizing. And so they're like, well, you technically don't need a 4-year degree for this position, but we're lazy and we don't want to have to actually figure out what people are capable of, because that costs us time and money. So we're going to offload that cost onto you. So you have to pay $100,000 for a 4-year degree, which has nothing to do with this particular job. But otherwise, we won't even look at your resume. We won't even look at your application or whatever. We'll just throw it in the trash because we got hundreds of others. So that's a cost that people have to pay. A lot of money, way more than the cars. But the cars are significant as well, because even in those jobs that don't require a college degree, like you're saying, now you need a car. You didn't used to need a car, but you need a car now. And it's the initial cost. It's the fact that you might get a car loan and you're paying a very high interest rate. Um, and especially when you're a young person, you're just like, well, I need a car, I need a job. You're forced to take out what is essentially a small mortgage. And you're paying a very high premium basically on the actual cost of the car. And then you're paying for gas. These are huge expenses that if we say like, oh well, in the 1970s, people could earn whatever $40,000 a year as a some kind of in retail, let's say a retail job, they earn $40,000 a year. And if we adjust for inflation, they're basically still earning $40,000 a year, but they also have video games and things and Uber Eats, so it's all good. But it's like, yeah, on paper they're earning $40,000 a year. But if you subtracted the increased cost of healthcare, if you subtracted the increased cost of education, have you subtracted the increased cost of gasoline and all of these things, and the fact that they're not actually working the 8 hours a day that's on paper, they're working 10 hours a day because of their commute. So in fact, if you go through all those things, it's like they're actually earning $20,000. Their income's cut in half. Now again, to actually vigorously, or not vigorously, I am feeling vigorous, but to rigorously quantify all of those costs and figure out how that impacts not just the average American, but specific sectors. So the bottom 20%, the bottom 40%, so on. That's work that probably people are working on, and I wish I had access to that right now, and I probably will end up trying to go through it myself and figure some of that out. But all of that is very real. And so I think we absolutely have a degradation or, as you're saying, income inequality because the middle class has all of these tariffs and garnishes and taxes that are implicit, that are basically privatized. It's not the government that's coming in and taxing you. It's the structure of urban planning in our cities. And so many other things, education, healthcare. But I guess as much as I think we're recognizing that there really is this decline in quality of life that's occurred in America, my other argument is that there is a sort of cultural decline that's going on. And both of these things can be true at the same time. It's not necessarily the case that, or it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, that you only have to believe, well, the average American is equally capable, competent, hardworking, ethical, whatever, in the current year as opposed to 50 years ago, and therefore the decline in wages is, purely an artifact of like some corporate greed or NIMBYism or whoever's at fault. And it's also not the case that, okay, well, all these lazy Americans, they have Uber Eats and iPhones, and they don't contribute anything to the economy's fake, everyone's on welfare, whatever, and they have it, the boomer adage of, oh, you guys don't know how easy you've had it, back in my day everything was hard. So both of those things I think the boomer, Zoomers have it so easy, I think we can obviously discount that and say that's false. There really is a drop in quality of life. But I think also we do have to look at competency, and maybe in certain intangible ways that and so I don't know, I might want to shift gears here, and I want to let you to respond to everything else I said, but to preview our next topic, sort of the dream job topic, I think kind of gets into this, like intercultural / economic interplay. So that's a preview, but I want you to respond to everything I just said.
Yeah, so in general, over recent years, I've become very averse to conspiratorial thinking, and I really like to push back against people who think like, oh, those elites, those rich people, those oligarchs, they're pulling all the strings. But the actual conspiracy that I believe in is really related to the auto industry and sort of the shaping of post-war suburban America, in the sense that like one of Eisenhower's cabinet nominees, I don't remember which position, was the CEO of General Motors, or former CEO. And one of the senators doing his hearing asked him about if there was a conflict of interest involved there. He said, "No, I don't believe there's a conflict of interest. What is good for General Motors is good for the United States of America." And there was this whole really entwined thing of the auto industry and the oil industry and people building roads, people building suburban homes where there was a lot of money to be made, and people were just following their interests, acting in self-interest, not trying to be evil. I don't believe people are trying to be evil, but there were a lot of incentives at work to really drive this sort of suburban, atomized, car dependent way of living that we've fallen into. And it is a tax. There's this giant tax to the United States of autodom in paying for all these things. And I would dispute that cars are cheaper than college, because college, at least as a limited time frame, 4 years, if you're paying for a car for basically your entire adult life, I think a lot of disparate estimates using different numbers coming from different sources have come out to like the average amount Americans are spending on a car is like $10,000 a year these days. So it does not take that many years for a car to start surpassing the cost of college. And sure, you could buy a used Toyota shipbox and keep it running for a long time and be set and save a lot of money compared to that, but the average is $10,000 a year. And yeah, that sort of credentialing issue you talk about of getting the degree just to sort of demonstrate your worth is maybe something of like a euphemistic IQ test, where if we could just sort of cut to the chase. And yeah, it is a very inefficient system, but I think it's also something of like tribal signaling of like where you went to college or what you studied tells employers a lot. I mean, I know in the music world, like a lot of people who don't quite make it as performers will then go into music admin. And I think there's a very much a nepotistic thing of like, oh, you're one of us, like we got to help you out. We'll get you this job working at this music conservatory or working in the back office for this orchestra. And it's very much like a tribal in-group nepotism signal as well, not just sort of, yeah, the credentials pull a lot of weight that is unspoken.
Yeah, I mean, that point about cars is really fascinating because you're absolutely right, and I've never made that logical conclusion before that people don't just buy one car in their life. You know, if you have 40 working years, conservatively speaking, then you're probably going to buy at least 4 cars, and that's, you know, assuming you maintain them and you have to pay for repair, like you said, $10,000 a year. You know, you're going to be spending, yeah, I mean, some people are effectively spending less, and it is true that despite what we're criticizing education now, but there is at least a possibility that getting a degree provides some sort of intangible benefit in terms of, you know, opening your mind to new possibilities, or making you a more well-rounded person, or making you more sophisticated or cultured or something like that. You know, cars don't really do that. Some people like driving cars. I mean, maybe some people like the commute, but at the same time, if there was much less demand for cars, cars would probably be cheaper. Because, you know, it wouldn't be the situation where we're forced as a pragmatic thing. It'd be like, hey, if you want to drive a car recreationally, then, you know, here you can buy your old sports car or something like that, you know. But
yeah, I mean, I keep seeing things about certain auto manufacturers like discontinuing whatever their like cheapest bottom of the line model is, and there's just this creep where they add another expensive luxury SUV and they chop off another compact, affordable car, and it's kind of a similar problem in the housing market, I guess. And the people saying like, oh, nobody's building starter homes anymore. Could go into that, but you said you wanted to shift gears, so let's keep going.
Oh God! Well, I don't know. You're drawing me back into the car thing. I mean, I almost feel like I have to like have the crazy, like I have to get my whiteboard out and I have to have like this crazy web of like, here's how they're screwing us on cars, and here's how that actually relates to education. And it's like there's feedback loops between these things. These aren't isolated.
Oh, I mean, there's this great Matt Iglesias line about how we auction access to the best schools through the real estate market.
Sorry, I was on mute. One of the things I wanted to mention earlier was uh, so talking about, should we try to improve cities where they are, or should we just, kind of, is Detroit, would it be more expedient to invest a lot of money into building nice houses in Detroit, or trying to do that, or start somewhere else? And I guess, I'm hearing from you, you think it's let's do it in Detroit. But one of the models for gentrification that I think has been successful, and it's not a group of rich people getting, I think the rich people getting together to build a new city is always a grift. I think they're always basically scamming their investors. That's my opinion. I think where it's not a grift and where it does work is when the government comes in and says, we're building a college, we're building a university. Now, does the government literally
Yeah.
do that? In most cases, no, it doesn't. It doesn't literally say, okay, the federal government is going to build this, and often it's at the state level. But effectively, because the federal government does provide so many incentives and supports for schools, we can talk about whether that's overbloated and good or bad or something. But effectively, what happens is it subsidizes the production or the construction of colleges and universities. That if you removed that federal support, at least at the tuition level, there would not be as much of an incentive to build those. And when you build a college or university, you bring in young people, you bring in intelligent people, you have a Starbucks, and then you have the second level, which is now it's like in family owned, coffee something, or it's this hippie whatever, the culture and the jazz music. And so all of that is part of gentrification. And to me, I think that's driven by where we choose to put our educational facilities. Because this is another thing where it's like, logically speaking, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't just like kidnap a bunch of Harvard professors, bring them to Kansas, build a bunch of buildings to be like, actually, this is Harvard now, and then bring all these Harvard students out there. And then it would, raise real estate prices. And then people would, that would create this artificial boost. So, I'm interested in how we could, because I think there is a value to not just having Zoom education. I think there is a value to bringing young people together. That's another thing that I think our colleges, to speak to your earlier point, right? We might have some disagreements on the value of community and cities, but there is a value. There is an intangible value to bringing a bunch of young, smart, creative people together and putting them all in housing, making them all neighbors, because they form connections that oftentimes you hear about some of the tech startups or some of America's biggest companies, and it's like some of these things were started in colleges by college roommates. So that's an effective, I mean, again, it's hard to measure that, but I think that does have an impact on economic growth and GDP. And if we just move to a purely like Zoom model, which I don't think we ever will, but if we're the further we head down that direction, I think we are losing something there. It's not immediately recognized. So I guess I feel like I've just thrown out so many things that we totally lost the directionality, and it could go in any way. But I guess again, I'm gonna let you take it wherever you want. But if you want to go in a different direction, the Dream Jobs article would be my next question.
Okay, so I would say I personally, just from a subjective perspective, value all those intangibles of college and of education very highly. Like that's just my kind of jam in life, is like learning more about the world, being a wide-ranging person. Like I think those are all goods for society, but I also recognize that that's sort of like a tribal impulse in me, that like those are my people and those are my values, and it's not a universal. But then there's this, I guess they're sort of a think tank city observatory based in my hometown, Portland. that has talked a lot about how like cities going forward into the 21st century, like that is the class of people that drives a lot of economic growth, and that like cities thrive based on their capacity to attract like college educated young people, because people are Americans are moving less and less, but like the most mobile class of people is like college educated 20 somethings. And so if you want your city to grow, you need to get people to move while they're of that demographic move to come to your city in that critical window. And you said, I feel the need to clarify on Detroit a little bit more. I wouldn't say Detroit is where we should build housing, but I would say that people in Detroit should act in the interest of their community and like try to make Detroit better for their sake. I think that like valuing your place as a part of your identity, this as also sort of gets into some of my anti-polarization takes, and like national politics don't matter nearly as much proportionally to how much we talk about them as local politics. And like Ezra Klein talks about this in Why We're Polarized, of like people used to place their state or their city way more highly on their like identity stack of like what was a salient important part of who they were than their like national party affiliation. That like someone in Detroit saying like I'm a I'm a person from Detroit, I care about good outcomes for Detroit, acting in the interests of Detroit, and me being in San Francisco and saying, I care about San Francisco thriving and acting in the interests of San Francisco and solving the problems of San Francisco. I think everyone working a lot more to solve local problems would do a lot of good for the country as a whole, and a lot of this like cultural malaise. And then there is maybe some sort of free market Darwinism to sort it out, of like maybe people in Detroit do everything they can to advocate for Detroit and make it better, and it still keeps losing people. I think they have had a bit of a turnaround though. I think their population decline has either slowed down or reversed in recent years. Don't cite me on that, but I think everyone acting in the interest of their sort of more local community sort of turns down the temperature on a lot of this national polarization, and at the same time is a lot more pro-social, because it's way more within our circle of control. It's not like, oh, I'm going to yell on the internet about this. It's like I can build a community here, I can get involved. And like a San Francisco Board of Supervisors race could be decided by a few hundred votes. Like that's something where people could actually make a difference rather than just like screaming into the wind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree sort of with your diagnosis, but I maybe am more cynical than you in thinking that um, kind of abstractly wishing that Detroiters would care more about Detroit, or any citizens of any city would care about anywhere that they live at all. Um, I think it's a little bit baked into the cake of our whole economic structure. I mean, again,